Hi everybody, and welcome to our Integrate Summer School. My name is Faith Stultz, and I'm the program manager here at BioLogos Integrate, and so excited to have you all here and joining us for our first ever virtual webinar. As it is our first ever virtual webinar, we are still working through a few little technical kinks. So we are working on getting the chat going. That will be up and running soon. And please, if you do have any other issues like sound not working or something like that, feel free to throw it in the chat if the chat is working, or the Q&A is also there for you as a way to communicate with us. So thank you for your patience as we, as always, are just figuring out technology. But more than that, we are so excited to have you here. Integrate has been a really exciting project for BioLogos because we just really feel passionately that our students and our kids growing up today are living in a world that is shaped and formed by science in so many ways. New technologies are always arising, and as Christians who believe that God's truth and who he is feeds into every part of our lives, we really want to give them, our students and kids, resources for how to think about making sense of science and technology in the light of their faith. And so that is what we are trying to do here. So I'm excited to have you all here and hope we can learn a bit together. Now is a great time. We'd love to hear who you are and where you're from. Let us know what kind of class teaching setting or otherwise. Are you a classroom teacher? Are you a parent? Are you a home educator, a pastor? Something else? We'd love to kind of hear who's in the audience and who we're talking to. So thank you for sharing that. Looks like we've got a Kentucky representative, a home educator in Ohio, Missouri, pastor in Colorado, a teacher from a Christian school. That's awesome. Keep those coming. We're excited to hear a little bit more about you. Now we're just going to jump in and start talking a little bit about Integrate. So get my slides going. All right, so I've called this Integrate Inside Out because the hope here is that this workshop is going to help you really get a good idea of what Integrate is as a curriculum. It's kind of a funky, not funky, it's an interesting puzzle piece that we really hope will fit into the needs that you have in your educational setting. So we want to help you understand what Integrate is, how it works, and really get a feel for the usage of it, because I know as a former high school science teacher, you can read the description of a curriculum all day long, but what you really want to do is to be able to flip through it and see what kinds of activities and resources and content are in there. And so our hope is that this is a way to really let you see and experience Integrate for yourself, and then think about some ways that it may or may not be a good fit for you in your setting. So we'll be talking a little bit about the instructional design of the curriculum and the role, the sort of different pieces that make that up. We hope by the end of this workshop, you'll also be able to feel excited about this idea of gracious dialogue and modeling that in your classroom or your setting for your students, because this is the heart and soul of BioLogos is about engaging with each other, other Christians of different perspectives or non-believers, with grace and humility and curiosity about what they believe and why. Apparently that's so important that I included it twice on our learning objectives. So there you go. And I also hope that you're able to identify a few things that you can weave into your classroom to help engage your students in these topics. Now, a little bit about BioLogos. If you're not familiar with us, we are a nonprofit based in Grand Rapids, Michigan. We were founded by Dr. Francis Collins. Francis Collins was the director of the Human Genome Project, which was the first project to sequenced the entire human genome back in 2003. And this was a massive undertaking. It cost billions of dollars and I think 13 years. And nowadays you can do the same thing for, I think, about $1,000 with a 24-hour turnaround time. So technology has come a long way, but he oversaw the project that did it for the very first time. So he's a leading geneticist. He was also the director of the NIH for, I believe, about 12 years under 3 different presidents, just retiring in the last year or so. And he, most importantly, is a passionate follower of Christ. And so he has been a vocal advocate for helping Christians understand that science and faith don't have to be in conflict. They really can work together to enhance our understanding of God and who he is and his role as creator, and really deepen our relationship with him. So to help further that goal, he founded BioLogos, where we hope to look at God's word and God's world and see how those can work together and work hand in hand. The 3 things that that really anchor our organization is Christ-centered faith, rigorous science, and gracious dialogue. And so we hope that those 3 themes really come out in the course of this workshop and the Integrate curriculum as a whole. Now, a little bit about Integrate. I'm guessing that most of you are here because you've heard of it, maybe you're interested, but you want to understand it a little bit more before diving in. And so the Integrate arose out of feedback that we got from teachers and home educators who said that they really want, when they look at the offerings to do faith and science for them, they often came up with 2 options. On the one hand was the secular science textbook, which has great high quality science, but no faith component, no faith integration, no option to sort of help support their students interacting with it as Christians, or the Christian textbooks, which traditionally take a young earth perspective and some other approaches to science that are not consistent with the consensus mainstream science understandings of origins and some other topics that we have today. And they didn't feel like there was anything in the middle that was offering a perspective where that science and faith can really come together. And so instead of rewriting a biology textbook from a Christian perspective, because those secular textbooks have great biology in them, we decided to make a curriculum supplement. So the hope here is that Integrate can be used alongside either a science secular textbook or a Christian textbook to bring in that faith conversation piece. We just talked about genetics in our textbook. Now let's bring in some theological reflection and think about, how do we make sense of gene editing and the ethical implications of that as Christians, and kind of help you have the resources and structure you need to guide your students through conversations around faith and science. It is geared towards secondary students, primarily high schoolers, but we have had teachers adapt it down to middle school and up to sort of introductory undergraduate level. And honestly, a lot of it could be used with an adult setting in, say, a church class or something like that as well. It's as a high school teacher who's seen a lot of curriculum, sometimes any curriculum for anyone under 18 is kind of like cheesy and goofy, and you wouldn't want to use it with adults. But I don't think Integrate comes across that way. I think it could be useful in a lot of different settings. Yeah. And it's very modular and flexible. So there's 15 different units, and we'll talk more later on about sort of how you can incorporate them into your classroom. But the expectation is not that if you are a biology teacher at a Christian school and you have to teach a full course of biology, there's no expectation that you would be able to fit in all 15 of these units into your instructional time. There just isn't enough time in the school year for that. And so we made it to be very modular. You can pick which topics are most interesting to you and mix and match and make it work for your students in your setting. And there's 4 major themes or bundles, we call them. The first one is Science and Faith Foundations, this big picture of how do science and faith relate to each other? How do they each help us understand the world around us in different and complementary ways? And could science actually be a Christian vocation, something that people can use as a way to love and serve God and others? Second is human biology and the big questions. We talk about cells and design here, genetic diversity and technologies, and a little bit about Unit 7, Fearfully and Wonderfully Made, is about embryology, and also neuroscience and how how embryos and babies are formed, and how our neuroscience, how our brains work, sort of set us uniquely aside from other animals, but also part of the wonderful biodiversity around us. Then we've got Bible and Origins, everyone's favorite bundle on evolution and the fossil record and how to make sense of all of that within the Genesis creation story. And lastly is Creation Care, talking not only about climate change, but also conservation efforts, how caring for the planet is actually a way that we can love our neighbors in a really deep and meaningful way. And also that just exploring nature is a way of exploring and experiencing God, which is always a good reminder. Now, oh, and one more, the Integrate team, just so you know kind of who's behind this. You've met me. All 6 of the women to the right of me are the authors of the curriculum. They are an incredible group, ranging from PhD biologists to experienced homeschool educators and experienced K-12 educators who bring just a wealth of experience and knowledge and compassion, really, to navigating these topics with students. So I just think they did a fabulous job writing this. My personal background is in astronomy, so it's good that I wasn't an author of the biology component here, but I think they did a great job. So that's just a little bit about them. Mark Whitwer here helps us with some of our professional development stuff. He comes from a long history of teaching in the classroom and also serving as director of curriculum and principal at various Christian schools. So kind of thinking on that big picture, how do we do science and faith at a school as a whole? Now today, there's my slide. Before we jump in, I want to take a minute to pray, because I think, one, it's always good to center ourselves. But I think this topic of science and faith can so often feel very charged and complicated and contentious, that it's helpful to remember what we're doing and why we're here. So join me for a quick prayer, please. Lord, we wonder at the beauty of your creation and are humbled by the task you've given us to reflect your glory and truth to our students. Please bless our time together and guide us as we consider how to teach our students in ways that promote love of God and neighbor. In your son's name, amen. So the plan for today is to start out by just walking through one unit. I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of how the curriculum works and is designed, and then we'll walk through one unit to give you, in a fair bit of detail, to give you a sense of really what it involves. And normally this workshop would be done in person, which means that I would be having you break up into small groups and talk to a neighbor and write things on the board. And because we really feel strongly that as curriculum writers and as educators, we should be modeling good pedagogy with each other, just like we hope that you do with your students. Unfortunately, all of those great engagement interactive activities are a lot harder to do on Zoom. And so there will be a couple opportunities to respond to questions in the chat, and I really hope that you take advantage of those. If you have other thoughts throughout anything that I'm saying, please, please, please share those in the chat. Have a whole conversation without me in the chat while I'm talking, and that will be great. We hope that this is a collaborative time that's really helpful for you. There will be a time for Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions that come up throughout the whole time that you'd love for me to address, the Q&A is the right place to put those. And we will get to those at the end. And the last thing I'll say is that we will be walking through some of the activities in the curriculum, and I'll give you a little bit of time to actually like think through how you would answer and that sort of thing. And I hope that you'll take the opportunity to actually do that. I know as a teacher, I've sat in a million professional development workshops, and you just kind of sit there and you smile and nod and you just kind of wait for them to go through it. But we all know that we learn best when we engage and participate. And so when there are opportunities to think about how you'd answer a question or do some little activity, if you think it's a good way for you to engage, maybe pull out a blank sheet of paper and write down your answers and participate. I encourage you to do what you need to do to kind of get the most out of this time. All right, with all of my caveats aside, let's start with the big picture and then we'll move in. Big picture is, I want you to know where we're coming from with this curriculum. I love this quote by somebody. The internet isn't sure. I haven't gotten a definitive reference on this. You'll see a poll popped up in front of you. I didn't quite finish writing it, so you can answer it as you see fit. Oh, or it disappeared. There we go. Either way. I love this quote, in essentials, unity, in non-essentials, liberty, in all things, charity. I think this really summarizes BioLogos's approach to the science and faith conversation, because the essential here is that God is the creator and sustainer of all things. That is what binds us all together as Christians, and we are unified on that. But when we think about science and faith, one of the most contentious topics is always origins. And, our perspective at BioLogos is that there's room for liberty within that space, that there's room for multiple Christian views on how God created and when he did and what processes he used. The Bible is a tricky book, and interpreting it is hard, and interpreting science is hard too. So our goal is not to convince anyone, either in this workshop or in the curriculum, to convince anyone of any one particular theological or scientific perspective. Our hope is to give our students the resources to think through what they believe and why, and understand where these viewpoints are coming from. BioLogos does hold an evolutionary creation standpoint, but we think that we have wonderful brothers and sisters in Christ who have different views on that, and that is just fine. And lastly, in all things charity, in everything that we do in this curriculum and as an organization, we prioritize gracious dialogue, and hope that you will join us in that practice, both here and in your classrooms, because I think we could do with a lot more of it in our society these days. So those are kind of our values overall. And within that's reflected in the curriculum, in that we want to equip students to become faithful, informed, and gracious voices on these difficult questions of science and technology. We want them to feel like they can ask hard questions and think deeply and really engage their faith in conversations around science and faith, that no question is out of bounds, and that there is space to bring their faith into these topics. We also want them to be informed scientifically with the best understanding of the current science that we have. Science is not a monolithic, stable thing that never changes. It is always growing and adapting with new evidence and data, but we want them to have the intellectual and academic skills to understand that science and engage with it. And lastly, to be gracious, to cultivate Christian values through the science and faith conversation, and be lights of graciousness and humility within that process. I won't go through all this. I'm already taking too long, but these are just kind of some of the themes and approaches that framed the way that we designed this curriculum. The one that I'll highlight at the bottom there is culturally competent pedagogy. If you haven't come across this term, I highly recommend that article there or just Googling the phrase. It sometimes goes by culturally responsive pedagogy. This is the idea that every student that walks into your room is a unique individual who's coming from a unique family background, social background, cultural, ethnic, socioeconomic. They're bringing the whole life experience into the classroom, and we should be engaging with all of who they are in the teaching process. And so our hope is that through this curriculum include some of those practices that help students bring who they are into the classroom and help those parts of themselves engage with the content. But again, check out that term and look into that if you're interested for more. All right, and almost the end of the nitty gritty, I promise. The curriculum, each unit has a backwards design model, which if you're not familiar with, says that we start with a central question that we're trying to answer through this unit. And from that central question, we say, all right, if this is the question we want to answer, what are the learning outcomes that students are going to need in order to be prepared to answer that question? So we say we want them to answer this question, which means by the end of the unit, they should be able to know or do these certain things. And then we say, well, how will we know if our students have reached those learning outcomes? We need some sort of assessment. And so we design an assessment or an activity. Summative assessment is maybe a strong word for our integrate modules, but the last piece of every unit is a big picture activity, opportunity for response, sort of activity that allows students to answer that central question, to bring everything they've learned in the unit to bear on how they personally would answer the central question that shaped the whole unit. The idea is that summative assessment helps us know whether our students met our learning outcomes. And then the last thing that we design is the actual body of the curriculum that prepares them for that assessment and meets those learning outcomes. So in Integrate, we have 5 different modules. You see the little icons there, or 5 different types of modules. And each of those bring a different piece to helping our students be prepared for that Integrate module. So the bulk of the curriculum, or bulk of the unit, will be made up of a meet, grow, experience, and engage models. Tell you what those are in a second. And then at the end, they do this Integrate one that brings it all together. And that sort of reflects back on the central question. So a little bit about those modules. Every unit starts with an introduction to a role model of a Christian who is either a scientist or maybe a theologian or philosopher, depending on the unit topic, who is living out, bringing that unit's topic into conversation with their faith and really blending those in a meaningful way. We think it's really important for students to have examples of people who are doing this well. And we've tried really hard to make those role models vary in a lot of ways in their roles, in their activities, in their backgrounds and experiences, to show that there are so many ways and so many different types of people who can be bringing science and faith together in their lives. The second piece, the second module of every unit, is going to be a grow module. This is essentially a short devotional that's focused on one Christian value or virtue that is connected to the topic of the unit. So it helps us sort of ground into a Christian virtue and see how it actually applies in a scientific setting. I'll give you an example of that so that can make a little bit more sense. The body, the meat and potatoes of each unit is going to be engage and experience modules, which are these activities that either focus on knowledge acquisition or maybe a lab or experiential something that focuses on bringing practices or sort of reflecting on new ideas that they've learned. And then the last piece of every unit is that integrate module, which, like I said, is sort of a summative activity that helps the students bring everything that they've learned in those other modules together to answer the unit's central question. All right, that's the abstract stuff. Let's jump in and see how this works out in one particular unit. We're going to look at unit 13, caring for people and the planet. And like I said, we're going to go through each activity here. And if you would like to be sort of jotting down notes, answering the questions for yourself, either independently or in the chat, we'd love to hear your thoughts as we go. So for this unit, the central question is, why should creation care be a priority for Christians? Everything that we're going to do in this unit is going to come back to why should Christians care about the environment? And so the learning outcomes for this are centered around that. I won't read all of these, but you can see how they connect to this idea. Are looking at the ideas, the theological ideas of dominion, that comes up in Genesis, and what that means here, thinking about the ways that the environment affects our neighbors, both local and far away, giving students an opportunity to actually practice creation care, get their hands literally and metaphorically dirty with it, and learning about ecosystems and how they work. So that's what our students are hopefully going to walk away from this unit with. But again, remember, what we really care about is this: why should creation care be a priority for students, or for Christians question? So I'm going to skip ahead out of order a little bit to the very end of the unit. And this is that last integrate module. And the module simply says, sets the scene for your students. You are telling your grandmother about your participation in an environmental restoration project. Your grandmother says to you, God gave us dominion over the earth, but the Bible says it's all going to burn up in the end. So why should Christians care? We hope that students sort of place themselves in this setting. Like, how do you respond to grandma? What do you say to her to answer her question? Why should Christians care about caring for creation? So I would love if you would take a minute here and actually think about this. What things would your students need in order to respond to grandma's question, why should Christians care about the earth? What ideas or concepts or new knowledge or skills might they need in order to respond to her? I'm going to give you a minute or two to think about that, and I would love to hear your answers in the chat. If you're willing to share, that would be really great. I know it's kind of a vague question. I've gone back and forth on how to frame this. But this is that kind of backward design in action. If we want them to be able to answer this question, grandma's question, what do we need to equip them with in order to do that? Mark says, gentleness as you are speaking with someone, care and love, not just the right answers, but clarity with charity. Ooh, I like that, clarity with charity. Another says perspective on why grandma would believe that in the first place. Absolutely. Understanding where grandma is coming from. Lucy says empathy to understand where her grandma is coming from and why she thinks that way. Common ground on the things they can agree on. You all are clearly on the gracious dialogue train. I love it. Understanding that creation is a reflection of God is something we need to steward and take care of. Awesome. Those are great answers. Keep them coming. If you would like, here were a couple of the things that I came up with. We might need to reflect on this idea of what does the Bible even say about our responsibility to care for creation? Does it say anything? And if so, what? Grandma's thrown out this word dominion. What does that word mean? We'll want to understand how our planet is affected by human activity, particularly how people around us and are affected by it and have compassion for their experience. And it might be helpful to think about or to have some examples of how actual Christians love their neighbors through caring for creation. Those were sort of some of the things that we wanted students to be able to kind of have in their arsenal to bring to an answer to Grandma's question. So the goal now is that the rest of all of the unit preceding this module should give them these things, should answer these questions or equip them with this knowledge. So our first module is our meet module, where we meet someone who is engaging in this topic. In this case, it's Jason Adkins. You can read a little bit more about him in general. He runs an urban farm based out of Trevecca, Nazarene, and I want to share just a short clip of a video that students would watch to get to know him and his perspective on creation care and loving our neighbors.
When we began talking about creation care, we like to think all the way back to the creation of the world, when God created humans in his own image as the crowning moment, after which he created all things that supported human life. And the job he gave humans was to be his image, to be God's image. And the way we like to understand the image of God as the one who created all things in loving care, who was pleased with what he was made, and continues to come in as death threatens his creation, his people, and save his creation from death. This is the picture of dominion, this God who comes and creates, who saves, and finally who in Jesus really defines power and kingship as something very different than what we've understood it to be. Over the centuries, we've looked to exploitative images of earthly kings in order to decide what it meant to be a king. And our relationship with creation has often been one of exploitation. When we heard the word dominion, this is what we thought of, a way to take from creation at its own expense. Jesus speaks explicitly against this kind of power. He says the rulers of the Gentiles love to rule it over them, and they like to be called benefactors, but you're not to be like this. In fact, the one who leads must be like the one who serves, and the greatest among you will be the least. So to be the image of God, to inhabit the holiness of God, it means to serve as Jesus served his creation, to lay one's life down for that with which we have been entrusted. This is to be the good shepherd after Jesus.
So the video goes on, and you in the module itself, you learn a bit more about Jason and his work at his farm and the way that he engages with his community, and but most importantly, how this work around growing food in an urban food desert and supporting the neighborhood's needs is really directly coming out of his idea of caring for God's creation, and how God calls us to join him in his love of the natural world and creation, and utilizing that for the good of others. So we have an example here of someone who's really bringing their faith and this idea of caring for the environment and for creation together in a meaningful way. So that is 13.1, module 1, the meet module. Next, we'll have, maybe if my slides advance, there we go, a grow module. And like I said, each grow module has a Christian virtue that it focuses on, that's tied into the theme of the unit. In this case, it's gentleness. Now, these are really framed as devotionals. We even have some teachers or home educators who choose to pull these grow modules out of each unit and actually just use those as like family devotionals or something, or even in a Bible class or something like that. So these are very flexible. And each one includes a virtue definition. So a definition of this virtue. In this case, gentleness is using our strength to nurture and care tenderly for others. It includes a verse to ponder. In this case, Isaiah 40:11. He tends his flock like a shepherd. He gathers the lambs in his arms and carries them close to his heart. He gently leads those that have young. You actually heard Jason Adkins mention this idea of shepherding as a key theme in caring for creation. There's much more. There's another longer scripture passage with some reflection questions and more content to it, but this is just the overview. And then we also like to include a quote to ponder. This one happens to be from St. Francis de Sales, who says, "Nothing is so strong as gentleness, nothing so gentle as real strength." And so just kind of getting our kids thinking about what is gentleness, and how could it be relevant in this topic. So the last part of this module is that we have a couple questions here that they can either journal about or maybe get in a small group and discuss, thinking about how could gentleness of God shepherding his people inspire our approach to caring for creatures and parts of creation that we have been put in charge of as God's stewards. And reflecting on that quote from Bishop Francis de Sales about gentleness and strength and how intertwined they are. So these are usually pretty short modules, but are bringing those Christian virtues into conversation with the topic at hand. And yeah, moving on ahead. So we've had our meet and grow, and now we come into our engage and experience modules. Now these can come in any order. There might be 2 engages in one experience or mix, different orders, but each unit looks a little bit different. This first one, 13.3, looks at the biblical basis for creation care. So this is answering that question, what does the Bible even say about what our role as humans is in caring for creation? And so students will watch a video. Again, I'm just going to show you a short clip here of a pastor reflecting on the idea of dominion and what that word really means.
This male and female, God made them in his very own image and gave them this.
Oh, excuse me.
This male and female, God made them in his very own image and gave them this command. Let us make humans in our image. Let them rule over the fish in the waters and the birds of the air. Let them rule over the livestock and over the whole earth. Let them rule over all of the creatures that move along the ground. This word rule comes from the Hebrew word mashal. In English, mashal has been translated as dominion, or to subdue, or even to rule over creation. But mashal describes love and responsibility modeled on the love and responsibility of the Creator himself, God. Mashal describes a person who rules or watches over as representative of God. God commands Adam and Eve to rule over creation just like God would rule over creation. So God invites us to care and love for creation in the way God would do so. This is both a command and a responsibility. There are many people in the world who care for God's creation. Even though they may not yet know God, they are participating in God's good work.
I first worked with bees when I went to capture a wild swarm on a farm in Waimanalo. The whole experience was surreal. There was 2 beehives, and as soon as they opened up the wooden pallets, there was thousands of bees swarming in the air, and the honeycomb was arranged in a rainbow. And I just remember bees flying around, if the afternoon light was shimmering through the trees, and I fell in love.
So again, that video goes on, but it gives us an opportunity to think a little bit more about this idea of dominion that often comes up in our English translations in the Bible, in Genesis, and what does that really mean, and what is God calling us to that? So students get a chance to reflect on that. And in particular, I like these questions on the left are some of those reflection questions that are in the curriculum that you could use either for group discussion or individual journaling response, or in any other format that you want. I like this last one. If Christians have a proper understanding of what dominion over creation means in the Bible, how might it affect their choices? If you'd like, I'd love to hear kind of some of your thoughts about answering that question. If we had a proper understanding of what dominion over creation means in the Bible, how might it affect our choices? Can you think of a few examples, maybe things that you would hope that your students would think of? I'll give you just a few seconds for that. Again, this is a my attempt at making this as interactive as we can. Would love to kind of hear your thoughts on this idea of dominion and how it is a tricky word in a lot of ways. All right, and as you keep thinking about that, we'll move on. That was part 1 of module 13.3, thinking about the biblical basis for creation. The next part, there we go, actually gets into the biblical passages and tries to kind of suss this out a little bit. What does the Bible actually say about our job of caring for his creation? Now, this is just kind of a snippet of the activity, but students are given a list of Bible verses. I picked just 4, but I think there's 8 or 10 of these sets. Some are single and some are multiple. And the idea is that the first thing that the students are asked to do is to read these verses and just summarize them in their own words. And so for Psalm 24:1 and John 1:1 through 3, students might say, all of creation is God's. God made the world and the world is dependent on God. And you can see some of the other summaries there. And while you're looking at those, we have a few thoughts on our dominion question. Dominion leads to other people's flourishing as well as the flourishing of the earth. It is a ruling in the spirit of Psalm 72. Awesome. How powerful humans are, the power we have been gifted by God to use for good, the job humans were given right at the beginning. Yeah, so lots of ideas of both of, I think dominion carries this feeling of power, and that's a big question of how do we use that power? Do we use it for the good of those around us and to further the work of God, or like he said like Jason said in that first video, in exploitation and great adding to ourselves instead of others. Awesome, thanks for that, guys. So our students have read these Bible verses and they've summarized them, and then the students are given a series of principles, which we sort of came up with, but think sort of cover a variety of principles that we find in the Bible, like earth keeping. As we are made in God's image and kept and sustained by God, so we must keep and sustain the Lord's creation. Faithfulness, enjoy but not destroy God's fruitfulness, which is a gift from God. Gratitude, the earth is the Lord's and not ours. And contentment, we must seek true contentment and demand less from the creation for ourselves. So these are some themes that the authors identified within these passages. And the activity is for students to match the set of verses with the corresponding principle of creation care. Sort of, where are we getting these ideas? You can think about those summaries and those principles for a second, see if you can match them yourselves. But I won't make you work too hard at it. The students, like I said, would have, I think there's more like 8 or 9 sets of these Bible verses, and so there'll be multiple examples for each of these principles. And so their worksheet might look something like this, where you're tying this idea, like in Genesis 1:26 and 2:15, of being made in the image of God, so that as representatives of God, we could rule and take care of God's creation as this earth-keeping principle. So hopefully this is a way for students to connect these abstract ideas with what the, where this is coming from in the Bible. How are we getting to these claims? All right, the next, this is the next module. I forgot to label it here. This is an experience which talks about human impacts on the planet. So we've talked about where this idea of caring for creation comes from biblically. Now let's kind of turn towards the sciencey ends of things and think about how are humans impacting the planet. There's a couple different pieces, different activities in this module. I just pulled out this one, for example. Students are sent to this interactive by the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, forget what the I stands for, but it's great. I just have some screenshots here, but it shows this nice little environmental scene, and your students are able to click on different forms of impact: atmospheric, cities, coastal habitats, forests, invasive species, and different geological epochs, and see how humans' activity has changed the planet from its original state. And so if you click all of the buttons like that, you end up with something like this, which honestly is not a terribly inaccurate representation of the world around us. We've got fishing going on, and a port here, a large city that's paved over a lot of areas. There's still some farming, but some deforestation. There's a dam here blocking up a river. And so if you kind of go back and forth, you can see just how much the environment is affected by our presence on it. So students would go sort of through these one by one, and you click on these and they have all sorts of additional information about exactly what, say, deforestation, what impact cutting down forests has on a local environment. And they summarize their findings in a graphic organizer. So that's one way that they're kind of getting that that understanding of what is humans' current impact on the planet that will hopefully contrast with our biblical calling to care for it. But we also wanted to make sure that the students knew that not everything humans do on the planet is bad. There's good stuff too. So the second part of this module highlights some news stories. This was written in 2020, so that's where they're from, but you can absolutely find more timely ones yourselves that help show that we are capable, and we often do good things for God's creation, care for it well, and support it, like using satellite imagery to help detect ocean plastic pollution so that we can clean it up, planting trees, or my favorite, the Australian Army cuddling and feeding koalas that were escaping forest fires. So making sure that this is not all doom and gloom. Like we are doing good things for the environment. There's the capacity for this. It's a matter of choosing to do it and getting out there and doing it. All right, that was 13.4. 13.5 focuses in on this idea of loving our neighbors. The title of this unit is Caring for People and the Planet. And so this is really getting at that idea of Jesus calls us to love our neighbors. One of the most fundamental commands for Christians is to love our neighbors. And does caring for creation actually equip us to love our neighbors well too? So students would watch a video. The whole thing is about 25 minutes. We're only going to watch 2 that thinks about this idea of environmental justice.
So environmental justice focuses on the negative impacts of the decisions that affect our environment on people of color and poor people. Historically, folks who come from those communities have suffered the most. And because of that, we have to be very sensitive to ensuring that the decisions that we make around our environment do not disproportionately affect them. We definitely have to care about the issues associated with climate change, but we also have to understand that, for example, because of our utilization of cars, that it has created bad air quality, and in particular for communities of color that live in urban areas. And so Those communities have a high asthma rate.
A lot of what we have to do is really talk about how we need to redefine environmentalism to think more inclusively than the traditional perception of the environmental movement, which tends to be on, saving the whales or flora and fauna as opposed to families and so forth. And so we really say that we're all a part of the environment, humans, wildlife, and we're all interdependent and we're all part of this ecosystem.
So that video goes on to explore those themes in more detail. But I love this because she's right. When you think of creation care, you think about being out in nature and caring for it, which is important and valuable. But people are part of the environment too. And there's nothing more fundamental. After loving God with our whole hearts, we're called to love our neighbors. And so this unit or this module reflects on this idea of the relationship, particularly between poverty and sickness and an unhealthy environment, and how do we make sense of that, and how do we respond to that, and how could our students individually learn about that? The second question I hear, or I have here is I particularly like is for your students to look at their particular area, whether it's whether you're in a big city or suburban area or rural, and to look at where are the major areas of pollution or other environmental harm near you, and go do some research and figure out what are the demographics of the communities that are closest to that. And is this video's prediction that the communities that are closest to, say, your local manufacturing hub or a place that's been cleared for industry or urban area that doesn't have much green space, what are the populations there, and are they fit into these categories of underserved or disenfranchised or impoverished, and sort of what do you make of those connections? So kind of putting those two pieces together for students, I think is really really important. All right, and then on computer. Nope, we already watched it. Don't need to do it again. All right, and then the second to last unit is an opportunity for the students to put all this in practice and to go participate in their own ecological restoration project. Now, granted, this is very open-ended because you all live all across the country, as we saw in the chat, and so there's no one-size-fits-all sort of activity we can offer for this, but we give you some guidance of how to help your students find opportunities in their local community to actually go and do some creation care. In particular, we recommend restoring a native ecosystem. You can reach out. This is just a screenshot. There's more information in the actual curriculum about how to go about finding an opportunity like this in your curriculum, in your community. But it gives students a way to take these abstract ideas that they've learned about, that God calls us to care for creation, that our actions have an effect on creation, either for harm or for good, and that the environment's state impacts those around us, and also globally, and so it matters how we interact with it. Now let's go out and interact with the environment and care for it in a positive way. And so students are sort of guided through finding an opportunity, and the worksheet listed there gives them some questions to answer beforehand, an opportunity to kind of journal about their experience, and a post activity that includes sort of a silly little creation care game to help them sort of reflect on what they did and what they accomplished, and how that connects with the things that they've been learning. So those are all of the sort of content pieces of Unit 13, which brings us back to GRAMA. So this is the point when students would be faced with this, this final module. You're telling your grandma about your participation in your environmental restoration project, which they just did in the previous model. So this is a very tangible, realistic scenario for them. Grandma says, God gave us dominion over the earth, but the Bible says it's all going to burn up in the end. So why should we care? And the question is, we said that these were some of the things that students would need in order to give grandma, be equipped to respond to grandma. And I hope that when you look through this list, you see that each of those previous modules that we just went through are providing that, thinking about, we looked at what the Bible does and doesn't say about our responsibility to care for creation. We looked at the term dominion and what it means. We learned a lot about how the planet is affected by human activity, for better or worse. We built some compassion for how the health of the planet affects other people, and learned about this idea of gentleness and how it applies to caring for people and for the world. And we saw some examples of how actual Christians are loving their neighbors through caring for creation. So we've equipped students with all of this. And then in this module, students, there's more structure within it that helps primarily have them respond in a written form, or you could get creative, have them do role play, you know, whatever your little teacher heart desires, to personally reflect and then share about how they would answer this question as a result. Whew. All right, we did it. We made it through Unit 13. I hope that gives you a better idea of how one unit flows, how it starts with that central question and those learning objectives, and then each module kind of builds on that to prepare students for this final integrate module, where they bring it all together and answer that that key. Well, we can look at that. Click, click, click. Brings it all together to answer that central question, which for us was, why should creation care be a priority for Christians? All right, now I'm going to pause there just to catch my breath. If you have any questions about what we just did, some of this like instructional design piece, the difference between the modules, that sort of thing, now is a great time to throw those in the Q&A, and we'll get to those in a little bit. We're going to move into a quick little time of thinking about some practices that you can do in the classroom or in the home education setting or in the church setting, wherever you are, that can help spur on conversations. Because a lot of this curriculum, as you probably saw, is a lot of just presenting students with ideas or stories and having them reflect on questions. And it's an art sometimes to get students to actually engage and respond and participate. So I've got some tips on that. But if you have any thoughts, or questions about anything we've covered thus far, now's a good time to throw them in the Q&A. All right, so let's move forward to a few classroom helpful practices. Let's just switch those. There we go. All right. Number one, for me, is creating safe spaces for hard questions. David Kinnaman has a book called You Lost Me, that looks at today's youth and 2016's youth, but still, and their response on their thoughts on Christianity and how they engage with the church and the Bible. And one of his findings was that more than a third of teens feel like they can't ask their most pressing questions in church. And for our purposes, I'm going to assume that Christian educational settings, like Christian schools, at least probably track with this trend for churches. And as a Christian educator myself, I mean, I'm glad that 2/3 of teens feel that way. Honestly, it feels like maybe it's sometimes less, but I want nothing else than for students to feel like their churches and their Christian schools and their Christian families are the places that they can bring their hardest questions. We want them to be coming to us and feeling like this is a space where we can ask and reflect and challenge and think critically about how our faith and the world and our experiences intersect. And so let's make our schools places where students feel like they can bring those hard and honest questions. And so a couple ways that we can do that, particularly I'm going to frame this in a K-12 traditional classroom setting, but home educators and pastors feel free to sort of extrapolate from this to your setting. One is be explicit about setting ground rules for conversations being based on respect and hospitality, because in order to ask hard questions, students have to feel like they'll get they'll be heard and get genuine answers. So let's make sure that our classroom is a place where they feel safe to do that. Emphasizing listening and curiosity, and also modeling how to approach hard questions with vulnerability and humility. I know that for me as a student, sometimes the best answer teachers had to my questions was, honestly, I don't know, but let's look into it together. And that's okay, especially with these science and faith questions that can be complicated and hard. And maybe you're not a PhD scientist and have an MDiv and feel super equipped to answer every single question your student has. And so modeling this idea of, I don't know, but let's go learn together and let's keep asking questions can encourage them to continue in that practice. One thing that I found in a classroom setting is that it can be really important to disconnect some of these like hard faith questions from graded work. So, and what I mean by that is that students want to get good grades. This don't have to convince you of this. They really want that A, right? And so sometimes they will be motivated to give you the answer that they think you want on a question or an assignment, instead of really thinking personally about what they think and why. And we want to make sure that, that this is their thinking, their reflection. This is not about telling them the right answers, but helping them arrive at their own answers. And so when I was in the classroom and doing units on topics like this, I would often have journal questions or discussion questions that were graded based on participation. Did you actually answer the question? Regardless of the content, did your answer respond, and in sufficient thought and detail? And that's kind of what they were graded on, not on the content of their answer. And sometimes even removing these conversations from the formal classroom setting can be what's necessary, because students feel like when they're in class, everything is graded and there is a right or wrong answer. And so sometimes outside of the classroom, during lunch or after school is a better time for some of these conversations. And lastly, implementing that culturally competent or responsive pedagogy can be really helpful for letting students know that they can bring their whole selves to this conversation. I think that module that talks about environmental justice and the disproportionate effects of air quality, say, on communities of color. This is not, this is different students in your classroom are going to have different experiences. Some students might know from personal experience what the impacts of that are, and some will have no concept of being in that kind of setting. And so making sure that you're aware of those dynamics and engaging those graciously and gently, and making space for them is important. So save space for hard questions. Second, this is actually a really easy one. It's just highlighting Christian Scientists. So often students might not know that it's okay to be a Christian and a scientist. This depends on your setting and your church background and that sort of thing. But so often I would have students that would come up to me and just say, like, I was just always told that scientists were atheists and they were out to disprove God. And I just didn't know that you could be a Christian and a scientist at the same time. And so giving them some examples and models, both of historical scientists, but I think more importantly, current Christian scientists, can be so valuable to help them know that this is an option for them. They can see how working as a scientist, if that's something that they're interested in, can actually be a unique tool and gift that God has given them to love God and worship Him and love others. It exposes them to a lot of different great careers, which is always great because there's so many different ways to be a scientist than just a lab researcher or a professor. It breaks down stereotypes of who can be a scientist, what a scientist looks like, what a scientist does all day. Looking at the scientific community today, I would love for there to be more vocal Christian voices in that space as science and technology continues to be a huge part of our culture, thinking about artificial intelligence and ChatGPT and genetic engineering. Like, we want our students to grow up into people who are in those conversations in a position to share their wisdom and Christian perspectives within that space. And so kind of building that pipeline is always valuable. Next, obviously, this is, if you're a science teacher, you want your science and faith conversations to connect to the science content. This quote from Willis says, students need a personal connection to the material, whether it's through engaging them emotionally or connecting the new information with previously acquired knowledge. Without that, students may not only disengage and quickly forget, but they may also lose the motivation to try. And so what this makes me think of is that many, not all of your students, but many will have some faith if you're teaching at a Christian school, at least some faith awareness, if not a personal active faith of their own. And so sometimes you get students who they're like, I'm not a science person. I'm not going to be studying science in college. Why do I need to know about how ecosystems work? And this is a way to build some connection between their personal experience and values and the science that they're learning, and say, you know, you might never be an ecologist, but by understanding how ecosystems work, you're understanding the impact that that humans have on ecosystems, and that can have on your neighbors. And as a Christian, you're called to love your neighbor. And so this actually like feeds into your spiritual formation and practice by learning sort of how these things are, that science and faith are not these siloed topics, but something that can actually interact. And so, you know, I hope looking back over those modules that we went through, there's a lot of opportunities for connecting the science with kids' personal experience, whether they live in an urban setting, or maybe their mom has an herb garden in the background, or maybe they've seen bees buzzing around, you know, like connecting with that is great. So engaging the science and faith topics as they arrive naturally. Please try to avoid superficial Bible verses as easy biblical integration. I had so many science teachers, or at least can think of so many examples of like, oh, it's physics class and we're doing our unit on light and optics and Jesus is the light of the world. So that's cool, moving on. And yeah, you've referenced a Bible verse that also has the word light in it, but there isn't any deep connection between this. And that communicates to students that there isn't a deep connection between the Bible and our understanding of the natural world. And so it's more important to make these meaningful connections to your content than just find a Bible verse that has the same word in it and slap it on the whiteboard and move on. It's also good to be wary of making God of the gaps claims. If you're not familiar with this term, this is the idea that we arrive at something in science, some question that science doesn't have an answer to. And so as Christians, we say, science can't explain this, therefore God did it, therefore God exists and is necessary, and boom, we proved God's existence. That might be true, that there is no scientific explanation for this thing and that God is where that came from. But it could also be true that science just hasn't answered it yet. And when science does come around to having an explanation for that topic, suddenly your proof of God has been explained away by science, and that's an uncomfortable place to be. So making sure that we're not setting up current unanswered scientific questions as proofs of God, I think is an important pitfall to avoid. And lastly, so much of science class and science textbooks are fundamental principles, mechanisms, processes, but all of those play out down the road in social impact ways. The concepts of mechanical and chemical energy wind up coming up in conversations of drilling for oil and what kind of fuel your car utilizes. Pollination is really important in agriculture. If all the bees go away, that's actually really problematic for our food growth and communities, and so on and so forth. And so making sure that you're making connections between the science content and some of those social applications, particularly if they're local, is really valuable for keeping students engaged and sort of making those faith connections. And lastly, offer lots of opportunities for reflections. Some science and faith questions are maybe not easy, but they're comfortable and sort of natural to engage in, like the beauty of the natural world tells us something about our God, and the diversity of organisms tells us that he is creative and loves lots of different things. But some topics are complex and hard and can be unsettling for students when we start to think about the implications, particularly if they point in a different direction than what they've been taught the Bible says. Origins and evolution topic being a key example of this. And so we need to make sure that we're giving students time to reflect, not feeding them right answers, but giving them resources and opportunities to reflect and ponder and think through how they put those pieces together. And to process what they believe and why. Because I'm a big believer that the goal isn't to tell students what to believe, but to help them figure out what they believe and understand why they believe it, so that it is their own faith, and one that they can continue to grow and develop, because they'll keep coming across hard questions and shifting ideas within their faith for their whole life. I hope that their belief system is not static as of 18 years old. And so we want to give them the experiences and the resources to learn how to continue to grow and deepen their faith throughout their lives. And I think that is my last one. Oh, look, I had thoughts. Offer journaling prompts with no right or wrong answers. One of my favorites is having students assign or interview adults about their views on the topic. In our first unit 1, we have a whole activity based around this. This is a great way to get parents involved, because parents can be a little bit sensitive, understandably so, about what you're communicating to your kids when you get on some of these more controversial topics like climate change and origins. And so this is a way to bring them into the conversation by having students, have your students write 5 questions to go ask their parents about their views on a science and faith topic, and come back and share what they heard and talk about that. So lots of rich discussions can come from those interviews that I really like. All right, I have done a lot of talking. I need to drink a little bit of water. So I thought now would be a good time for a little bit of reflection. I'd love for you to think just a bit about is there any one big idea or one application or just anything that you're going to take away from today, and to share that in the chat. This is, again, this is one of those good pedagogy things of writing it down helps solidify it in your brain and helps you hold accountable to it. And I would love to hear what you take away from this. And, if you have any other ideas of what science and faith in the classroom could look like, anything at all, I would love to hear from you of kind of what you're going to take away from this workshop. Now is also a great time to be adding some questions to the Q&A as we move towards that part of the afternoon. Questions could range from about the curriculum itself. A little bit after that, after this, I'll tell you a little bit more about the rest of the curriculum and other resources that we have. But I'd love to hear questions about your particular educational setting. If you're wondering sort of how this fits into a homeschool setting or a church setting, or really any questions, or what BioLogos thinks about different topics, whatever you have, throw those in the Q&A. I'd love to get a chance to address those. But right now, I would also really like to hear kind of what some of your takeaways are from this talk so far. All right. Henriette says, having students write a reflection that is assessed based on technical aspects as opposed to the content. Awesome. Yep. I think it's honestly, from an assessment perspective, it's tricky to know how to grade on that. And it usually means that people generally do well on those assignments because as long as they kind of completed it and put genuine effort into it, they're going to do well. But I found that it really helps students to let go of I need to know the right answer and feel the freedom to express their own thoughts. And that comes back to having set a tone in your class from the start that students don't have to agree with you, the teacher, or with the school on different things, that they can be their own person and share those thoughts, and we can be in conversation and dialogue with each other, even if we don't all agree. Elizabeth says, avoiding superficial Bible verses as easy integration. Yep. Avoiding God's gaps, encouraging interviews, and clarification on which units to use this year. That's awesome. I'm glad those were helpful tips for you. The one of my favorite Bible verse connections, I had a teacher friend once who found out that I was excited about science and faith issues and came from a physics background. And they said, here's what I'm thinking. Here's my idea. Jesus is the light of the world. And in Genesis, God said, let there be light when he created. And Einstein says E equals mc squared, which means that when you take the speed of light and you slow it down, it turns into matter, which is not what E equals mc squared means, but that's another topic. And so therefore, God created the world by taking the Jesus as the light that was, when he said, let there be light, that was Jesus light. And then he slowed Jesus light down and that manifested into the physical world. And that's how God created. And I was like, oh gosh, there's so much wrong scientifically and theologically with that whole framework of just taking the idea of light in this gospel passage and light in this Genesis passage and equating them. So just remember that the Bible wasn't written in English is really what I'm trying to say. Marcy, gracious dialogue, the way you talk with others, is it more important than having the correct viewpoint? Yeah, those are great. I love those takeaways. Let me move on. We've got a couple minutes left. So really quick, I want to share with you just my little promo for the curriculum as a whole. You can see some of the other topics here. We went over Unit 13 down here, caring for people and the planet. Every one of these units is formulated in the same way with a meet and a grow module, followed by those sort of really content pieces, and then finishing with an integrate module that sort of brings it all together back to that central question. These are designed to work both in a classroom setting and a homeschool setting. I know there's some home educators out there. This workshop right now was intended to kind of give you a sense of how the curriculum works. The next workshop that we're doing this afternoon starts in about 40 minutes, is taking all of this and applying it specifically to homeschool setting. And so saying, like, how do you take this curriculum and use it in a homeschool setting that's unique from a classroom setting? So if that is you, I strongly recommend that you join us, come back. It'll be a different Zoom meetings link, but on the Eventbrite page, and join us for that one to learn more about the homeschool setting. For any of you out there, classroom teachers or homeschool teachers, are the primary sort of use case that we think of for Integrate is pairing it with a secular biology textbook, or any biology textbook for that matter, and bringing in pieces from Integrate, coordinating with the topics as they're covered in the textbook. Miller and Levine biology is one of the most widely used secular college textbooks, although Kenneth Miller, one of the authors, is a practicing Catholic and a man of deep faith, and just kind of a cool fact for you to know. And so what we've actually done is we have created a curriculum map that takes all of the units and chapters and lessons line by line of Miller and Levine and mapped onto that which Integrate units would fit well throughout that whole textbook. It's a long document, but we've worked really hard to kind of do the hard work of thinking about the integration piece for you so you don't have to. We actually just finished this, and you all are the very first people to have access to it. So you can find a link in the chat and take a look at that to hopefully make it easier for you to pair Integrate with your biology textbook. I would also be really curious in the chat if you have other textbooks that you use, whether secular or Christian, that a curriculum map like this would be helpful for. We are fully planning on doing more of these for other textbooks. Kind of on our radar is Campbell, which is often used for AP, also Novare and Apologia, which I know a lot of homeschool parents use. But if you have other recommendations of textbooks that this would be helpful for, throw them in the chat and we would love to hear that. And just so you know, BioLogos has even more than just Integrate. We've got tons of other resources that educators like you might be interested in. We've got a speakers bureau of incredible scientists, theologians, and thinkers who would be more than happy to come to you and speak at your chapel or your classroom or your church. They have expertise on all sorts of different topics: biologists, chemists, physicists, astronomers, theologians, biblical scholars, all sorts of stuff. So if that's something that you're interested in, check it out on our website. It's called Voices, our speakers bureau. We also run professional development workshops. Look, you're in one. If something like this would be valuable for you and your, say, your co-op, or maybe the science department or Bible departments at your school, we would love to offer those either in person or virtually. This one was all about the curriculum, but we also do entire workshops on how to foster gracious dialogue in your classroom, or explaining the different Christian viewpoints on origins and how to sort of converse graciously around that, and all sorts of other topics. So you can check out biologos.org/integrate to see a list of our workshops. We actually have grant funding right now to heavily subsidize the cost of flying someone, myself or someone else from our team, out to you to run those workshops. And we have to use that money for that. And so if that is at all of interest to you, please shoot me an email, integrate@biologos.org, and we'd love to set something up. We've got webinars, free webinars with special guests, articles, podcasts, all sorts of great stuff. The two I want to highlight is also our monthly Integrate newsletter, which features all sorts of science and faith education resources, usually from outside of BioLogos, that we see and think are awesome and want you to have on your radar. And when you sign up for that newsletter, you actually get a free copy of Unit 1 of the curriculum. So if you want to kind of flip through another unit to get a better sense of that, signing up for our newsletter is a great way to do that. And we have a Facebook group of homeschool educators and teachers who are using it and talking to each other about how it works and questions they have, and getting recommendations and things. You can find links to all of that stuff on biologos.org/integrate. All right, I will stop there. We do have some questions, and so I will take a few minutes to respond to those. Great question from Harriet. If a teacher were to use all the modules, how many hours of teaching class periods would be incorporated in a unit? I'm so glad you asked. Every unit has, here's the one that we went through today. Every unit has a unit overview page, and it includes a teaching time recommendation. So that unit that we went through today, we estimate would take between 4.5 to 6 hours of instruction time to cover. That does not include the students going out and doing that like native ecosystem restoration project. And then for each individual model, it has it broken down. So the GROW module is expected to take 15 to 25 minutes. I have a document that if you email me, I can send to you, that has on one sheet all of the units and all of their teaching time, so that you could sort of add that up together. But our estimate is that if you were to basically just start at Unit 1 and teach, say, an hour a day, like sort of a normal instruction time for one course, the all 15 U's could probably take you up, at least a semester, if not through a whole year. You could actually use this curriculum as a standalone faith and science curriculum for like a Bible elective or something like that. I hope that helps answer your question. Another one, we are in a micro school environment that is wonderful in so many ways, but uses Apologia to teach science, which has been quite a challenge. Yes, Apologia is a very popular Christian Science textbook that doesn't always reflect mainstream science. How do you advise you graciously integrate your program into a teaching curriculum that is so closed off to other ideas? Awesome question. The first answer is don't lead with evolution, because like we've talked about in this gracious dialogue, and so many of you have pointed out, it always works best to start from a point of common ground. And so there are some units here that hit some of those more controversial topics, but there's many that are a lot more sort of unifying, that lots of people with different perspectives on origins or things like that could still get behind. Unit 12 is a good example of that, which is over there, but you can't see it. Unit 12 is called Seeing God in Creation, and it focuses on the idea of God. The world around us is God's creation. It has his fingerprints all over it, which means when we go out into the world and look at trees and plants and animals and interact with them, we're interacting with God's creation. We're learning about him and his characteristics and what he values and being led into worship. And I think that's something that anyone, could get behind regardless of theological views on Genesis. And so starting with some of those topics can be a little bit more easy. And the Science as a Christian Vocation, Unit 3 is another example of that doesn't have any controversial topics in it. It's focusing on this idea of you can use science to love God and love others, and giving examples of that. Can you use Integrate for younger kids if we did it as a family? Sure. I mean, I think there's a lot, your kids better than anyone else, especially if you have an age range, if you have some elementary, junior high, high school where they can kind of be engaging with it, learning from each other. I think that's great. Flip through the units or the modules and sort of pick ones that you think are going to be a better fit. But we've certainly had teachers use it with 6th graders, and there's components of it that could be appropriate for younger. If you're looking for more elementary resources, again, you can shoot me an email, integrate@biologos.org. And we don't have a curriculum at that age level yet, but we do have some other resource suggestions that can be helpful with younger kids. Let's see, got a couple more minutes. Do we need the science text to be able to understand everything in curriculum? Awesome, good question. The curriculum does not set out to explain the science content. We're assuming that the students are learning the science from a textbook or some other sort of science curriculum that you have in place. And these are just intended to bring the faith component into conversation with it. Now, there are some units that do lean a little bit more heavy in the science or address there specifically in the origins issues. There are some that look at, say, progressions of fossils, where we actually see those intermediate fossil examples that between species and that sort of thing. So there is some science content in there, but generally you would need a separate science text if you were teaching, say, biology or environmental science with Integrate. This is truly a faith and science supplement, not a science curriculum. All right, and last but not least, can I still use this on my own, like if I wanted to work through it over breaks or in the summer? sure, go for it. It's not intended as sort of a personal study. So it's not written in that framework, but but you could certainly do it, read through the articles, watch the videos, answer the reflection questions, do the worksheets. That would totally work too. BioLogos is working on some other resources that might be a better fit for sort of individual study. So we have lots of articles and podcasts that explore many of these themes at an adult level, just as an article or podcast or that sort of thing. So that might also be a good resource for you, but by all means, if you want to do it by yourself, go for it and let us know how it goes. All right, it is 2:30 on the dot, and I am wildly impressed with myself for ending on time. So thank you all so much for being here. It's been great to have you all. Thanks for using the chat and getting involved. If you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate to email me at integrate@biologos.org. We'll throw that in the chat so that you can find it, and I would love to answer any questions. Oh, and I promised a promo code. I will send you a promo code for 30% off the curriculum, and we'll send you a follow-up email tomorrow with just some follow-up resources. And so that promo code will be in there for you. All right, with that, thank you so much for coming. Have a great rest of your day, and I hope to see some of you in our homeschooling webinar in half an hour. Goodbye, everyone.